The morning sun filtered through the tall glass windows of First National Bank, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. It was Tuesday just after 9 o'clock, and the bank was already buzzing with activity. People in business suits hurried past the teller windows, their expensive shoes clicking against the stone floor. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from the customer service area, mixing with the faint scent of leather from the plush waiting chairs. David Chen straightened his tie and surveyed the lobby with satisfaction. As the regional manager, he took pride in maintaining what he called the bank's professional atmosphere. Everything had to be perfect. Every customer had to fit the image he believed the bank should project. Today, like every day, he watched the entrance carefully, making mental notes about who belonged and who didn't. David had worked his way up from a junior loan officer to his current position over the past 8 years. He drove a BMW, lived in the suburbs, and made sure everyone knew about his success. His office overlooked the main floor, giving him a clear view of all the daily operations. He liked to think of himself as the guardian of the bank's reputation. The morning rush was in full swing when David noticed something that made him frown. An older man had just walked through the revolving door, and David immediately felt his chest tighten with disapproval. The man was probably in his 60s, with graying hair and weathered hands that spoke of years of hard work. He wore clean but simple clothes, a button-down shirt, work pants, and sturdy boots that had seen better days. In his hand, he carried an old leather bag that looked like it had been with him for decades. This wasn't the type of customer David wanted to see in his bank. First National prided itself on serving successful professionals, wealthy retirees, and established business owners. This man looked like he might be more comfortable at one of those community banks across town. David watched as the man looked around the lobby, taking in the expensive artwork and gleaming fixtures with quiet observation. The man's name was Robert Washington, though David didn't know that yet. Robert had been up since 5 in the morning, as was his habit. He'd started his day by checking on one of his construction sites, then stopped by his auto repair shop to make sure everything was running smoothly. Now he had some banking business to take care of, something he'd been putting off for a few weeks. Robert joined the line behind 3 other customers, patiently waiting his turn. He didn't seem bothered by the fancy surroundings or the way some of the other customers glanced at him with curiosity. He'd been dealing with assumptions about his appearance his entire life, and at 62 years old, he'd learned that actions spoke louder than appearances. David couldn't concentrate on his morning reports. He kept glancing down at Robert, feeling more irritated by the minute. Other customers were starting to notice the man too, and David worried about what they might think. This was exactly the kind of situation he worked hard to prevent. The bank's image was everything, and having the wrong type of person in the lobby could send the wrong message to their valued clients. As David watched, Robert reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook. He flipped through a few pages, apparently checking something. The gesture seemed innocent enough, but David's imagination began to run wild. What if this man was planning something? What if he was casing the place? David had heard stories about banks being targeted by people who didn't look like typical criminals. The line moved slowly, as it always did during the morning rush. Robert waited patiently, occasionally checking his watch but never showing signs of impatience. He exchanged polite nods with the woman in front of him when she turned around, and even helped an elderly lady who dropped her purse, quickly gathering her scattered belongings and handing them back to her with a warm smile. These small acts of kindness only made David more suspicious. In his mind, Robert was trying too hard to blend in, to appear harmless. David had attended several security seminars over the years, and he remembered being told that criminals often tried to appear overly friendly to avoid suspicion. As Robert moved closer to the front of the line, David made his decision. He couldn't just stand by and watch while someone who clearly didn't belong made other customers uncomfortable. His job was to protect the bank and its reputation, and that's exactly what he was going to do. David left his office and walked down the stairs to the main floor, his footsteps echoing in the spacious lobby. He approached the customer service area, trying to look casual while keeping his eyes on Robert. Several tellers had noticed him coming down from his office, which was unusual for this time of day. David rarely left his office during the morning rush unless there was a problem. The woman in front of Robert finished her transaction and walked away, leaving him next in line. As he stepped forward toward the available teller, David saw his opportunity. This was the moment to act, to show everyone in the bank that he was vigilant and protective of their interests. Robert reached the teller window and began to reach into his jacket pocket, presumably for his identification or account information. David couldn't wait any longer. He had to act now, before anything happened that might embarrass the bank or put other customers at risk. The lobby was full of people conducting their daily banking business, completely unaware that David was about to create a scene that would change everything. Business executives checked their phones while waiting in line. Elderly couples discussed their retirement plans in hushed tones, and young professionals hurried through their transactions before heading to work. David took a deep breath and prepared to approach Robert. In his mind, he was about to protect his bank and his customers from a potential threat. He had no idea that he was actually about to make the biggest mistake of his career, one that would not only cost him his job, but also teach him a lesson about judgment and assumptions that he would never forget. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the dangers of judging people by their appearance and reveal just how wrong first impressions could be. David's polished shoes clicked against the marble floor as he approached the teller window where Robert was conducting his business. The sound seemed louder than usual in the suddenly quiet lobby, as if the very air was holding its breath for what was about to happen. "Excuse me, sir," David called out, his voice carrying across the open space with an authority that made several nearby customers turn their heads. Robert looked up from the paperwork he was organizing, his expression calm and polite. The teller, a young woman named Lisa who had been with the bank for 2 years, glanced nervously between the two men. "I'm David Chen, the regional manager here," David announced, making sure his voice was loud enough for others to hear. He wanted everyone to know that he was in charge, that he was handling the situation. "I couldn't help but notice you've been waiting in our lobby for quite some time." Robert nodded politely. "Yes, sir. Just waiting my turn like everyone else. The line was a bit long this morning, but that's perfectly fine with me." David's eyes narrowed as he looked Robert up and down, taking in every detail of his appearance. The work boots, the simple clothes, the weathered hands that spoke of manual labor. Everything about this man seemed out of place in David's carefully maintained environment. "I see," David said, though his tone suggested he didn't see it all. "And what brings you to First National today?" "This is quite an upscale establishment, and I want to make sure you're in the right place." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Other customers had stopped their conversations and were watching the exchange with growing interest and discomfort. Lisa shifted nervously behind the counter, unsure whether she should intervene or continue with the transaction. Robert remained remarkably calm. He had faced this kind of treatment before, though it never stopped being disappointing. "I have some banking business to take care of," he replied simply. "Just like any other customer." "Banking business," David repeated as if the words tasted sour in his mouth. "I see. Well, I'm going to need to see some identification and proof that you have accounts with us. We have very strict security protocols here at First National." The request wasn't unusual in itself. Banks often asked for identification. But the way David made the request in front of a growing audience with a tone that suggested suspicion and doubt made it clear that this wasn't standard procedure. This was harassment disguised as security. Robert reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet, a simple leather bifold that had seen many years of use. He handed over his driver's license without complaint, though several people in the lobby could see the flash of sadness that crossed his face. David took the license and examined it as if it might be fake, holding it up to the light and checking every detail. "Robert Washington," David read aloud, making sure everyone could hear. "And you claim to have accounts here at First National?" "I don't claim anything," Robert replied, his voice still steady. "I have accounts here. Ms. Lisa was just helping me with some paperwork when you arrived." David turned to Lisa, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. "What type of transaction was Mr. Washington attempting to make?" he asked, emphasizing the word attempting, as if Robert might not be capable of legitimate banking business. "He was making a deposit, sir," Lisa answered quietly. "A substantial deposit, actually. He has proper account information and identification." This answer seemed to surprise David, who had expected to hear about a small check cashing or perhaps a request for a loan that the bank would obviously deny. A substantial deposit didn't fit the narrative he had created in his mind about who Robert was and why he was there. A substantial deposit, David repeated, his voice skeptical. And where might this money be coming from, Mr. Washington? We have to be very careful about the source of large deposits. There are federal regulations, you understand. The implication was clear, and it wasn't lost on anyone in the lobby. David was suggesting that Robert might be involved in something illegal, that his money might not be legitimate. Several customers looked away, embarrassed to be witnessing such obvious discrimination. Others shook their heads in disgust, though none spoke up. Robert looked directly at David, his eyes steady and dignified. The money comes from my businesses, he said simply. All perfectly legal and documented, as you'll see if you check my account history. Your businesses, David said with a slight laugh that held no humor. And what kind of businesses might those be? I own a construction company and an auto repair shop, Robert replied, both here in the city. I also have some rental properties and other investments. David's expression grew even more skeptical. He found it hard to believe that this man in work clothes could own multiple businesses. In David's mind, successful business owners wore expensive suits and drove luxury cars. They didn't show up at banks looking like they had just finished changing someone's oil. I see, David said, though his tone made it clear he didn't believe a word of it. Well, I think we need to verify some of this information before we proceed. Lisa, I want you to pull up Mr. Washington's complete account history. Let's take a look at what we're dealing with here. The request was unusual and humiliating. Account histories were private information, typically only reviewed during formal investigations or when a customer specifically requested their own records. To demand such a review in front of other customers was a clear violation of banking privacy norms. Robert's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained composed. That seems unnecessary, he said quietly. I'm just making a routine deposit, the same kind I've made many times before. I'll determine what's necessary, David replied sharply. This is my bank, and I have a responsibility to ensure that all transactions are legitimate. I'm sure you understand. What David didn't understand was that his behavior was being noticed by more than just the customers in the lobby. The bank's security cameras were recording everything, and in the office upstairs, other employees were beginning to take notice of the unusual commotion on the main floor. Lisa reluctantly began pulling up Robert's account information on her computer screen, her fingers hesitating over the keyboard. She had been trained to respect customer privacy, and what she was being asked to do felt wrong. But David was her boss, and she was afraid of losing her job if she refused. As the information began to appear on the screen, Lisa's eyes widened slightly. She quickly glanced at David, then back at the screen, then at Robert. Something about what she was seeing didn't match what was happening in front of her. David noticed her reaction and moved closer to the counter, trying to get a look at the screen himself. What is it? He demanded. What do you see? The lobby had grown quieter as more customers became aware of the scene unfolding at the teller window. Some people left their places in line to move closer, drawn by curiosity and growing concern about what they were witnessing. Robert stood patiently through it all, his dignity intact despite the public humiliation. He had faced prejudice before, but it never got easier. Still, he knew that responding with anger would only make things worse. So he waited, knowing that the truth would eventually come to light, though he had no idea just how dramatically that truth would be revealed. Lisa's fingers trembled slightly as she scrolled through Robert's account information on her computer screen. What she was seeing didn't make sense with what was happening in front of her. David leaned closer, trying to get a better view of the monitor, his face showing the confidence of someone who expected to find exactly what he was looking for. Well, David prompted impatiently. What do you see? Small account balance? Recent overdrafts? Suspicious activity? Lisa glanced nervously between the screen and Robert, who stood waiting with the same calm patience he had shown throughout this entire ordeal. She had never been in a situation like this before, and she wasn't sure how to handle what she was discovering. Sir, Lisa said quietly, perhaps we should discuss this privately in your office. Nonsense, David replied dismissively. If Mr. Washington has nothing to hide, then there's no reason we can't handle this right here. I want our other customers to see that we take security seriously at First National. Several customers in the lobby shifted uncomfortably. An elderly woman near the back of the line whispered something to her husband, shaking her head in disapproval. A young businessman in an expensive suit looked at his watch and sighed, clearly annoyed by the delay but reluctant to get involved. David reached over the counter and tilted the computer screen so he could see it better. "Let's see what we have here," he said confidently. "I'm sure we'll find something that explains why Mr. Washington here thinks he belongs in our establishment." As David's eyes scanned the screen, his confident expression began to change. His eyebrows furrowed and he leaned closer to make sure he was reading correctly. The smug smile that had been playing at the corners of his mouth slowly faded. "This can't be right," David muttered, scrolling up and down through the account information. "There must be some mistake." Robert watched silently as David's face grew paler with each passing second. The older man had seen this look before, the moment when someone realized their assumptions had been completely wrong. It was never a pleasant moment, but it was often a necessary one. "What kind of mistake?" Lisa asked, though she already knew what David was discovering. She had seen it all when she first pulled up the accounts. David's voice was barely above a whisper now. "These account balances? They're enormous. Multiple accounts, all with significant funds. Business accounts, personal accounts, investment accounts." He looked up at Robert with confusion and growing alarm. "How is this possible?" Robert remained calm, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "It's possible because I've worked hard my entire life," he said simply. "I built my businesses from nothing, saved my money and invested wisely. Just like thousands of other people do every day." David scrolled through more of the account history, his face growing redder with each transaction he saw. Deposits in the tens of thousands, transfers between accounts that showed sophisticated financial management, automatic investments that demonstrated long-term planning and substantial wealth. "But you're—" David started to say, then caught himself. He was about to say something that would reveal the true nature of his prejudice, and some small part of his brain warned him to stop. "I'm what?" Robert asked quietly, though he already knew what David had been about to say. The lobby had grown completely silent now. Even the normal sounds of banking business had stopped, as tellers and customers alike focused on the drama unfolding at the main counter. Some people were beginning to understand what was really happening here, and they didn't like what they were seeing. David tried to recover, but he was clearly shaken. "This is unexpected," he stammered. "Your appearance. I mean, your style of dress. It doesn't usually indicate—" "Doesn't usually indicate what?" Robert pressed gently. "Doesn't indicate success? Doesn't indicate wealth? Doesn't indicate that someone might be a legitimate bank customer?" Lisa had seen enough. "Mr. Washington has been a customer here for over 15 years, she said, her voice growing stronger as she found her courage. "He's never had any problems with his accounts. He's never bounced a check or missed a payment. His credit rating is excellent." David shot her a sharp look, angry that she was undermining his authority, but Lisa continued. "In fact, Mr. Washington is one of our most valued customers. His accounts represent a significant portion of our branch's total deposits." This information hit David like a physical blow. He had built his career on maintaining relationships with the bank's wealthy customers, and now he realized he had just publicly humiliated one of the wealthiest clients the branch had. 15 years, Robert said softly. "I've been banking here since this branch opened. I've watched it grow and change. I've seen managers come and go, but I've never been treated like this before." David's mind was racing as he tried to figure out how to salvage the situation. He was beginning to realize that his assumptions had not only been wrong, they had been spectacularly, catastrophically wrong, but his pride made it difficult for him to admit his mistake. "Well, you have to understand," David said, his voice defensive. "We have security protocols. When someone comes in dressed casually, we have to be careful." "Careful of what?" asked a voice from behind them. They all turned to see an older gentleman in an expensive suit who had been waiting in line. "Careful of a man who wants to make a deposit at the bank where he's been a customer for 15 years? Other customers began to murmur their agreement. A woman near the front of the line spoke up. "This is disgraceful. The way you've treated this gentleman is absolutely disgraceful." David could feel the situation spinning out of control. What had started as what he thought was a simple security check had turned into a public relations nightmare. He could see other employees upstairs looking down at the commotion, and he knew word of this incident would spread quickly through the bank. But the worst was yet to come. As David continued scrolling through Robert's account information, he began to notice something else that made his blood run cold. There were connections between Robert's accounts and other accounts he recognized. Accounts belonging to some of the city's most prominent businesses and organizations. "Lisa," David said, his voice barely audible, "what's this connection here? This automatic transfer that happens every month?" Lisa looked at the screen and felt her heart sink. She had hoped David wouldn't notice that particular detail, at least not yet. That's a distribution from the Washington Investment Group," she said reluctantly. "The Washington Investment Group," David repeated slowly. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. Robert watched as understanding began to dawn on David's face. It was like watching someone solve a puzzle piece by piece until the final picture became clear, and that picture was about to change everything. "The Washington Investment Group," David said again, this time with growing horror in his voice. "That's the company that owns the building this bank is in. That's the company that—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The realization was too overwhelming, too devastating to put into words. But Robert finished it for him. "That's the company that owns the majority stake in the holding company that controls this bank," Robert said quietly. "Yes, that's correct." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. David felt his knees go weak as the full implications of what he had done began to sink in. He hadn't just humiliated a wealthy customer. He had just publicly embarrassed and discriminated against someone who was, in effect, his ultimate boss. The silence in the bank lobby was deafening. David stood frozen, staring at the computer screen as if willing the information to change, to somehow be different from what he was seeing. But the numbers didn't lie, and neither did the connection between Robert's accounts and the investment group that controlled the bank's destiny. "I don't understand," David whispered, though part of him was beginning to understand all too well. "You're saying that you—" "I'm saying that I own a controlling interest in this bank," Robert replied calmly. "Through my investment group, yes. I don't usually make a big deal about it because I prefer to let the professional managers handle the day-to-day operations." David felt the room spinning around him. This couldn't be happening. This had to be some kind of mistake, some cosmic joke that would be revealed any moment. But as he looked at Robert, really looked at him for the first time, he began to see things he had missed before, the quiet confidence that never wavered, even under pressure. The way Robert carried himself with natural authority. The expensive watch on his wrist that David had dismissed as a fake. The quality leather of his old bag, worn but clearly well made. All the signs had been there, but David's prejudices had blinded him to what he was really seeing. "The Washington Investment Group," David said slowly, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "I've seen that name on corporate documents. I've attended meetings where executives talked about the holding company, but I never paid attention to who actually owned it." "Most people don't," Robert said, "and that's fine with me. I built my wealth by focusing on the work, not on making sure everyone knew who I was." A movement near the bank's entrance caught everyone's attention. Through the glass doors they could see a black sedan pulling up to the curb. David recognized the car immediately. It belonged to Patricia Williams, the bank's senior vice president. She only made unscheduled visits to branches when there was a serious problem. "Oh no," Lisa whispered, realizing what was about to happen. Someone upstairs had obviously called the corporate office to report the disturbance. On the main floor, Patricia Williams stepped through the bank's revolving door with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to handling crises. She was in her 50s, impeccably dressed, and had a reputation for being both brilliant and ruthless when it came to protecting the bank's interests. Her eyes immediately found the crowd gathered around the teller window. As she approached, Patricia's gaze fell on Robert, and her expression changed completely. The stern, businesslike mask she wore dissolved into one of genuine warmth and respect. "Mr. Washington," she said, extending her hand with a smile. "What a pleasant surprise to see you here. I hope everything is going well with your banking needs today." David watched in horror as his worst fears were confirmed. Patricia clearly knew Robert, and from her deferential tone, she obviously knew exactly who he was. "Hello, Patricia," Robert replied, shaking her hand. "Actually, I've run into a bit of a situation here. Your regional manager seems to have some concerns about my presence in the bank." Patricia's smile faded as she turned to look at David. Her eyes moved from his pale, sweating face to the computer screen still displaying Robert's account information, then to the crowd of customers who were watching the scene with obvious disapproval. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass, "perhaps you could explain to me what's happening here." David opened his mouth, but no words came out. How could he possibly explain what he had done? How could he tell his superior that he had just spent the last 20 minutes publicly humiliating the man who essentially owned the bank? "David thought I looked suspicious," Robert said, saving David from having to find the words. "He questioned whether I belonged here, demanded to see my identification, and insisted on reviewing my account history in front of all these people." Patricia's face went through several different shades of red as the implications of what she was hearing sank in. She had worked in banking for over 25 years, and she had never encountered a situation quite like this one. "Suspicious," she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "You found Mr. Washington suspicious." "I was just following security protocols," David managed to stammer. His appearance. I was trying to protect the bank's interests." "Protect the bank's interests," Patricia said, and David could hear the barely controlled fury in her voice. "By humiliating one of our most important stakeholders? By violating his privacy? By creating a public spectacle that has likely been witnessed by dozens of our customers?" David realized that several people in the lobby were holding up their phones, and he felt a new wave of panic wash over him. In today's world, incidents like this could be recorded and shared across social media within minutes. The bank's reputation could be destroyed before he even left the building. "I didn't know," David said weakly. "How was I supposed to know who he was?" "You weren't supposed to know who he was," Patricia replied sharply. "You were supposed to treat every customer with respect and dignity, regardless of their appearance or your personal assumptions about them." Robert held up a hand, gently interrupting the conversation. "Perhaps we could discuss this somewhere more private," he suggested. "I think we've provided enough entertainment for everyone here." Patricia nodded immediately. "Of course, Mr. Washington. Would you prefer to use the conference room upstairs, or would you rather go to the corporate office?" "The conference room will be fine," Robert said. He turned to address the crowd of customers who had witnessed the entire incident. "I apologize that your banking business was interrupted today. Please know that this is not how First National normally operates, and I'm confident it won't happen again." Several customers nodded appreciatively, though David could see the disappointment and disgust still evident on many faces. These people had watched him reveal his true character, and it wasn't a pretty sight. As they prepared to move to the conference room, Patricia turned back to David. "Mr. Chen, you'll be joining us, of course. We have a great deal to discuss." David nodded numbly, knowing that his career was effectively over. As they walked toward the elevator, he caught sight of his reflection in the polished wall panels. The confident, successful regional manager who had started the day was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he had just witnessed his own professional funeral. Because, in many ways, he had. The elevator doors closed behind them with a soft chime, carrying them toward a conversation that would change everything. For David, it would be the end of his time at First National. For Robert, it would be an opportunity to ensure that no other customer would ever face the kind of treatment he had just endured. And for Patricia, it would be a reminder of why the bank's policies about respect and dignity weren't just nice ideas. They were essential to the very survival of the institution she had spent her career building. The conference room on the second floor of First National Bank had witnessed many important meetings over the years, but none quite like the one that was about to take place. The room was elegant but understated, with a large mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs and windows that overlooked the busy street below. Robert took a seat at the head of the table, not because anyone offered it to him, but because it seemed natural for him to be there. Patricia sat to his right, while David reluctantly took a chair across from them, looking like a man awaiting his execution. "Before we begin," Robert said, his voice calm and measured, "I want to make something clear. This isn't about revenge or punishment for the sake of punishment. This is about making sure something like this never happens again to anyone else." Patricia nodded in agreement, though David could see the tension in her shoulders. She was walking a tightrope, trying to balance her loyalty to the bank with her need to address what had just happened. "Mr. Washington," Patricia began, "on behalf of First National Bank, I want to offer you our sincere apologies for what you experienced today. What happened in our lobby was completely unacceptable, and goes against every value our institution claims to represent." "I appreciate that," Robert replied, "but I'm more interested in understanding how it happened in the first place. David, help me understand your thinking today. What made you decide to approach me the way you did?" David looked up, surprised to be addressed directly. He had expected to be ignored while the two executives discussed his fate. The question was fair, but answering it honestly would require him to confront some uncomfortable truths about himself. "I thought—" David paused, struggling to find the right words. "I thought you looked out of place. Your clothes, your appearance, they didn't match what I expected from our typical customers." "And what do your typical customers look like?" Robert asked. David realized he was walking into dangerous territory, but there was no way to avoid it now. "Business suits, expensive cars, people who look successful." "People who look successful," Robert repeated thoughtfully. "And in your mind, I didn't look successful?" "No, sir. You didn't." Robert leaned back in his chair, considering David's honest answer. "Tell me about your background, David. Where did you grow up?" The question seemed to come out of nowhere, but David answered anyway. "Suburbs of Chicago. My father was an accountant, my mother was a teacher. Middle-class family, nothing fancy. Good education." "Yes, sir. I went to State University, got my business degree, worked my way up through the banking industry." "Worked your way up," Robert noted. "That suggests you understand something about earning success through effort rather than inheriting it." David nodded. "Not sure where this was leading." "I grew up in a neighborhood where most people worked with their hands," Robert continued. "My father was a mechanic, my mother cleaned houses. We didn't have much money, but we had something more important. We had dignity." Patricia listened quietly, understanding that Robert was teaching a lesson that went far beyond banking policies. "When I started my first business," Robert continued, "I spent most of my time in work clothes because I was doing the work myself. I couldn't afford to hire employees, so I was the one doing construction, fixing cars, whatever needed to be done. Even after I became successful, I never lost the habit of checking on my businesses personally, of getting my hands dirty when necessary." David was beginning to understand where this was going, and he didn't like what he was learning about himself. "You see, David, you made a fundamental error in judgment today. You confused appearance with worth, clothing with character. You assumed that because I didn't dress like your idea of a successful person, I must not be worthy of respect. I was wrong," David said quietly. "I can see that now." "Yes, you were wrong," Robert agreed. "But more importantly, you were wrong in a way that could have serious consequences for this bank and for other people who might be judged by their appearance rather than their actions." Patricia leaned forward. "Mr. Washington, what would you like to see happen as a result of today's incident?" Robert was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the street below. "I'd like to see this become a learning opportunity," he said finally. "Not just for David, but for everyone who works in this bank." "I don't understand," David said. "I'm going to require some changes," Robert explained. "First, every employee in this bank, from tellers to managers to executives, is going to go through comprehensive training on respect, dignity, and unconscious bias. This training will be repeated annually." Patricia was already taking notes. "That's certainly reasonable." "Second, I want new policies put in place that protect customers from the kind of treatment I received today. Clear guidelines about when and how security concerns should be addressed, with oversight to prevent abuse." "Absolutely," Patricia agreed. "Third, I want to establish a customer advocacy program, someone customers can contact if they feel they've been treated unfairly, with the authority to investigate and address concerns." David listened to these requirements with growing dread. He knew his career at First National was over, but he was beginning to understand that the consequences of his actions would extend far beyond his own job. "And finally," Robert continued, looking directly at David, "I want David to be personally involved in implementing these changes before he leaves the bank." David's head snapped up. "Before I leave? Your employment here is terminated, effective immediately," Patricia said firmly. "What Mr. Washington is offering you is an opportunity to help fix the problem you created before you go." Robert stood up and walked to the window. "David, you made a mistake today, a serious, hurtful mistake. But everyone deserves a chance to learn from their errors and try to make amends." David felt tears forming in his eyes. He had expected anger, expected to be thrown out of the building immediately. He hadn't expected this kind of measured response, this opportunity for redemption. "I want you to help develop the training program," Robert continued. "I want you to share your experience today, to help other employees understand how easy it is to let prejudice cloud judgment. Your story could prevent someone else from making the same mistake." "You want me to tell other people about what I did?" David asked. "I want you to help other people learn from what you did," Robert corrected. "There's a difference." Patricia closed her notebook. "We'll arrange for you to work with our Human Resources Department and outside consultants to develop these programs. You'll have 2 weeks to help create something meaningful, and then your employment will end with a neutral reference." It was more than David had any right to expect, and he knew it. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Both of you. I don't deserve this kind of consideration." "Maybe not," Robert said, returning to his seat. "But everyone deserves a chance to do better. The question is whether you'll take that chance." 6 months later, the training program David helped develop was being implemented in banks across the country. The incident at First National had become a case study in how unconscious bias could damage both individuals and institutions, but also in how organizations could learn and grow from their mistakes. David found a new job at a community bank, where his experience had taught him to value every customer, regardless of their appearance. He never forgot the lesson Robert Washington had taught him, and he made sure to share that lesson with others whenever he had the opportunity. Robert continued to visit his bank regularly, usually dressed in the same simple clothes he had always worn. But now every employee knew that success and worth couldn't be measured by appearances alone. They had learned that dignity and respect weren't luxuries to be given only to certain customers. They were fundamental rights that belonged to everyone who walked through their doors. The story of what happened that Tuesday morning became part of the bank's culture, a reminder that true leadership means seeing the value in every person, regardless of how they might appear on the surface. It was a lesson that changed not just policies and procedures, but hearts and minds as well.